Recording in progress.
Evet.
Okay, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the week 4 of the week world building course. And it will be a long day today. There's lots of material to cover, so let's go to it straight away. Let me just share my screen with you. I want to share the screen, and it is screen 2. Okay. And I can also share sound. We don't have lots of footage today. I'm sorry about that, but that's life. Okay, let's go. So, what did we do in the last week? Let's make a quick recap. We talked about star systems, stars and their orbits. We talked about planets and how to create a planet effectively. We talked about atmosphere, volcanic activity. This allowed us to see where the mountains would be because of tectonic plate movements. And atmosphere was mainly about the color of the sky, but it's going to have importance down the road as well. And when we said currents, we talked about air currents and water currents, if water is the preferred source of liquid in your world, and how they affect climate, the placement of forests and such. And we talked about lakes and rivers, how lakes always flow downhill and how they don't split up, but they combine, blah, blah, blah. And we also said these are all susceptible, these are all subject to change. Because as an example, in Dragonlance, the world can just explode with a burning mountain down one side, and all this can go down to drain. So then we talked about maps in games and how we will think about maps in games, because we have world maps. Some world maps are purely based on lore. They don't have any place in the game. But some maps are gameplay world maps. And then we have overland map style. We have local maps of cities and other stuff. And we have a special kind of map called dungeon map, the kind of map that we use to navigate inside the level, or for specific navigation, especially in traversal things. So just let's continue. Now, there is one thing important that we have to consider when we are creating a world, and that is the ecosystem. Because we know that everything exists together, so everything coexists, so to speak. And if we are going to design one thing, we should consider everything else as well, because they cannot exit. Let me just put this on do not disturb. Sorry. Let me just. I should be able to change this. Oh, here it is. Okay. So, what is an ecosystem? So, an ecosystem is a geographic area. This is something we will lightly consider because we may not need a geographical area in a game where plants, animals, and other organisms, as well as weather and landscapes, work together to form a bubble of life. So, an ecosystem is basically a system, and if you have taken any thermodynamics, you would remember from that lesson that a system is something that is enclosed. So you can define anything as a system, but what you should do when you are defining a system is that you should know all the entrances and exits into the system. In terms of thermodynamics, this is an entrance and exit of energy and an entrance and exit of matter. So two things can enter and exit a system in thermodynamics. It's either energy or it is matter. But for example, if I have a system here that gives me energy, let's make this the sun in terms of our world, and let's make here our earth, our pale blue dot. Now, if we consider earth as a system in itself, we should consider the energy and mass entrance and exits. And we can say safely that there is negligible mass entrance and exit because there's nothing that comes into the world, into Earth. or nothing goes out of the Earth. I mean, we throw spacecraft, but it doesn't go anywhere. It's around. But Sun has a serious input of energy, and Earth radiates a serious amount of energy as albedo. So we have to consider these in the ecosystem. You cannot just say this is a closed system and there is nothing that's coming in, because we have sunlight. But we can make the system like this. We can choose the system however we like. We can choose sun as part of the system, and then considering Earth, there is no energy entrance or exit, but of course sun radiates energy outside. But from Earth's perspective, nothing changes. So, so when we say a system, this is what we think. When we say an ecosystem, this is about the ecology of the said system. So this example here, this guy, I'm sorry, he put plants inside a bottle, this bottle, in around 1960s, I guess, and he let it be. And then he opened the bottle 10 years later, put in some water, some more water, and then plugged it back in, and this bottle is closed for 50 years. It hasn't been opened since. And this ecosystem, there is an ecosystem inside this that is self-sustaining. So the plants don't wither and die. When they die, they create compost for new plants, and this bottle, the life inside this bottle lives on. But of course, you can say that this bottle takes sunlight in. So there's an energy entrance. This ecosystem is not completely isolated from the outside, but there is no mass entrance or exit. But any life inside this, hopefully not any animals trapped, but any plant life inside this is sustaining itself. So, and if it has gone on for 50 years, it can probably go on for hundreds of years as well. This is the example for an ecosystem. So, when we think about ecosystem, we think about what we care about is actually two things: plants and animals, because especially in games, those are the things that we encounter inside the game world. So Flora means plant life, and fauna means animal life. Now, when we design our stuff for the world, we have some design choices that we can make. Just clean this up. So, what I mean is, when we want to design a world, we have to fill it with plants and animals. And what kind of plants and animals are we going to use? We have to decide on that. So we have certain design choices to make, and we have certain paths to take. Now, the first one and the easiest one is, we use what we already have on Earth. So the world will have horses and rabbits and pine trees, anything you see on Earth. And this is because easy, it's ready to use, so you don't have to invent a whole bunch of stuff just to make it interesting. The advantage is the audience is already familiar with them, and you don't have to tell an audience what a horse is, for example, as a mount, or you don't have to tell them what a rabbit is, or you don't have to tell them how trees work. In turn, this is not very creative, but in certain simple design choices, creativity may not be what we need. So if we want the player to feel the familiarity of the world, again, we can give an example of Skyrim here, or any other RPG for that matter. We want the world to be familiar enough so that the players will be comfortable to move inside or to live inside. And then we will introduce the alien stuff, like the monsters in The Witcher. The world is a normal world, but there are magical creatures around. But then again, you can go a different route and try to create an entirely alien world. Now, we have three choices. The first choice is that we use what we already have. The second choice is we can use the known mythological or fantastic creatures. We can use dragons or griffins or minotaurs, for example. We can use zombies. They are also known mythological creatures. It doesn't have to derive from world mythology, but in a sense, it will derive from world mythology because those are the things that we know. For example, zombies are actually a myth from Central America. And normally, zombies are creatures, dead people, that come back to life, but they don't attack humans. They are just used for labor in the myth. So you create them with some sort of voodoo magic, as far as I know. But this has taken a different turn. For example, in 1930s, in Hollywood movies, they were used as such. So I think they were present in one movie or two movies. But then came, I think it was Day of the Dead from, let me see the movie, 1985. So I think it was John Romero's movie. Let me just look it up. Yes, Day of the Dead. George Romero zombie movies in chronological order. Night of the Living Dead, sorry. Here it is. Let me just show it to you. 1986. And then 1978. Now, the interesting thing here is, normally, the type of zombies created in these movies, George Romero's zombie films, they are unique. So they were a new take on zombies. Slow, rotten corpse, goes after humans, tries to eat brains, etc. But because of a quirk, they forgot to copyright the movie. So the movie is an open domain, which means the zombies created inside it are on open domain, public domain, sorry, not open domain. So because they are public domain, anyone can use that zombie concept because it's not copyrighted. That's where the zombies we know came from. So normal humans looking horrifyingly dead and trying to walk around slowly, going after living things and trying to eat their brains, actually came up from this movie. It's not in the world mythology. But that is the zombie template that we accept throughout the world and in pop culture. Okay. So, the thing is, the audience probably knows about zombies, for example, or these creatures, even though every movie or game tries to give them a different name for some reason. They don't want to say the zombie word, but they want to walkers, crawlers, or brain eaters or something like that. But now, the downside when using these mythological or fantastic or sci-fi creatures is it may be difficult to explain the differences that your version has from the template version. So when you create a different kind of zombie, it might be met with a resistance. So changes in design may not be welcome. For example, this is an elf. It's a kind of textbook Tolkien elf. So you see the features, and when you see this, you see, oh, the hair is blue, but it's an elf because of the pointy ears or the stature or the elegant sword that she's carrying or something. But the word elf doesn't actually mean the same thing all around. So this is, for example, a Santa elf. This is actually what an elf was before Tolkien came along in world mythology. So they were, in some mythologies, they were little things that help Santa, and I think in some mythologies they are not even particularly good. But then again, for example, there is the Harry Potter elves. The Harry Potter elves are quite different than what we see in here. And when you want to make a twist on these, for example, you can create an elf like this. Now, this is a Dark Sun elf, and I've talked about Dark Sun in this course before. Now, Dark Sun is a world that takes many concepts and turns them upside down, especially concepts in D&D. For example, in D&D games, undeads are aplenty. You can see undead everywhere, and skeletons are actually a very good first level enemies. You just destroy them and move on. But in Dark Sun, if you see an undead, you just turn and run, because in Dark Sun there are a very little number of undead, and almost all of them have the capacity to kill entire cities. Another concept that Dark Sun has turned upside down is magic, for example. In normal fantastic worlds, you see a magic user and you don't think about it twice, but in Dark Sun, magic is hated and shunned, so magic users are killed whenever they are seen, mostly. And in the case of elves, now Dark Sun elves are not resolute and all celestial and such. They are hot-blooded, very quick to respond, very impulsive, and they kill first, ask questions later. And they run everywhere. They are very fast, agile, yes, like the Tolkien elves that we know, but they are very fast. They don't use mounts. They run everywhere, and they make excellent messengers, for example. So this take on elf is very different than the classical D&D elf that we see. But since Dark Sun is a world that turns everything upside down, this concept is not entirely startling. So you don't say, oh, what? This isn't the way an elf is when you see them, because everything in the world is twisted in some manner. But then again, certain changes really may not be welcome in the community. So you create a vampire and you make them sparkle instead of being hurt by the sunlight. As far as I know, I haven't read the books. I have read them. I read the first half of the first book, but I had to drop it for health reasons, in mental health reasons. So the vampires in this work of fiction glow instead of being harmed by sunlight. And there is the author actually went ahead and created a reason for that, and I think it was a reasonable reason. It was plausible, but it doesn't matter. So what happened here is they took the concept of vampire and turned it into something entirely different that maybe undermined the reason that vampires don't go into sunlight. So it's not lethal, they just don't want to be exposed and humiliated, blah, blah, blah. But sometimes, the point is, sometimes the change is not welcome. Now, and sometimes the change doesn't matter at all. So here, for example, we see the concept of dragon. Now, this is a Western dragon, as the Middle Ages and other Western cultures see it. This is, by the way, a 3rd edition dragon drawn by Todd Lockwood, a wonderful artist. And I think his image of a dragon is the best one ever drawn, but let's not drift. And this is an Eastern dragon. So in Eastern cultures, dragons are magical creatures. Of course, these dragons are also magical, but Eastern dragons can fly but don't have wings, and they are snake-like. So this Western concept of a dragon is at least based a little bit on anatomy, so the muscle structure, wings and stuff. But this one is purely magical, and that's not bad. This is just a different take on a dragon. Now, when you see these dragon archetypes in the world, we come to this. This is a wyvern in D&D terminology. So the main difference between a dragon and the wyvern is that dragon has 4 legs and wings, but for a wyvern, the front legs are wings. So the arms basically are wings, but the dragon has 4 legs, so it's quadruped and with wings. And wyverns are seen as a lesser type of dragon. They are less powerful. And then there is the drake. The drake is a dragon with no wings. And this is the least form, as it is weaved in the D&D terminology. But, for example, when you use the term dragon, we generally understand this. But, for example, in Game of Thrones, when you look at a dragon, it is practically a wyvern in D&D terms. So there are many discussions on online that are these dragons, are these wyverns, but when you consider them within the Game of Thrones terminology, they are dragons, because first, there are no wyverns in that world, and these ones are named dragons. Second, they also fulfill the expectation of a dragon in terms of power or coolness and such. So you don't say, oh, these are just wyverns. You say they are dragons. And they are very nicely designed dragons and size and otherwise. So this is, really sorry, just give me a second here. So when we talk about dragons, it is a defined creature actually, but we have some wiggle space, and we can even create something that looks like a rabbit and call it a dragon, but that could be stretching out a bit. Let me just show something to you. This is another take on a dragon. Here it is. This is a webcomic called Earthworld. So these are dragons, not dragons, but dragons. Here you go. But for example, these are griffins. There are no R's in the world. This is a webcomic. It's a wonderful webcomic. You can read it. I don't know its current state. I've been reading it about 5 or 6 years ago. But these are basically plush toys. And these are Earthworld plushies. And is this a dragon? It's a dragon. And that is the rendition of a dragon in the Earthworld as a dragon. Let me see if there are any other. Just write Earthworld. They put out something content apparently. Okay. So, and the third choice that we can make is we can design our own plants and animals, completely new, original designs. Now, the thing is that they are original and they look cool. Oh, we have designed completely new things. But the problems that we may face here is that it requires initiation to the audience. So something that they have never seen before requires a certain amount of time to intake. So they're going to look, what does this plant look like? What does it do? Is it a fruit? Is it something else? And with animals, it is the need is more immediate, because is it a mount? Is it an enemy? Especially in a game when you see a creature for the first time, some cues are required to describe what they are to us. So, for example, if when we see a creature, and that is basically a ball of fur, we may not know what it is. Oh, why is not my screen casting correctly? Problem. Okay, it doesn't matter. Let's get rid of it. But if you see spikes on a creature, for example, you would think that it is dangerous. No, this doesn't work. Too bad. Okay, it works now. So this may break the flow, especially in written forms. In novels, you have to stop and explain what that creature looks like and what it does and how it moves. But it's not so difficult in games. You just show them and make them listen to the sound of it, and the players will get an idea of what it will do or what it is. So in that sense, the degree of familiarity should be balanced in terms of form and function. For example, this is from Avatar, and in Avatar, as you would remember the movie, the entire world is designed from scratch so that it would feel like an alien world to us. But they kept a degree of familiarity so that we can understand this is a mount, this is a horse with a USB connection. So you just connect the end of your hair to the end of its hair, and you are connected. And it has 6 legs, some weird thing here that might be for breathing, and antlers, and 4 eyes. So it has alien aspects, but the form is also provided so that we can understand what it does. For example, let's switch to this one. This is from No Man's Sky, and this is procedurally generated. And you can kind of tell that it is procedurally generated because it is giant and you have no idea what its function would be, except from maybe attacking you. It doesn't have any familiarity to any animal that we have on Earth. I mean, it looks like a spider, but it doesn't have the exact leg structure of a spider. It more looks like leaves. And this one is from the renewed Star Wars from 1999. So this creature was not there in the first original A New Hope, but in the remastered version they put this one in. And this one is also a mount, and it carries a degree of familiarity with elephant and other stuff. And this is, I think, from Fantastic Creatures and Where to Find Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, but I'm not familiar with the animal. But you can see that it has some predatory properties with spikes and horns and stuff, and eyes are small and menacing. So these kind of design choices that we make will actually convey a feeling and a concept to the audience. Even if we design something from scratch, we will pull from the pool of resources that we have in our cultures. What a mount looks like, what an enemy looks like, what a gentle giant looks like, for example. So now let's recap. We have 3 design choices, and okay, we can use what we already have, completely reuse the entire catalog of Earth, Flora and Fauna, and that's okay. We can use the known mythological and fantastic creatures, and we can design our own, completely different ones. But we can also mix and match. So let's move on. So, and this brings us to carbon. This is the basis for life, and everything on Earth is carbon based. And why is this? Because now this will be a chemistry lesson. Carbon has 4 electrons in its outermost orbit, and it has capacity for 8, if you remember from chemistry lessons. So this means one carbon atom can make 4 connections and take 4 more electrons. Now, why is this important? We normally don't care about this, right? But it means it can make an infinitely complex chain of materials. And these infinitely complex chains of materials are the basis of life. That's why we are carbon-based life forms. Everything on Earth is carbon-based. So, and the main components for life are carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And we actually call materials composed mainly of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen organic materials, even if they are not alive. For example, PVC is an organic material. It's the stuff we use on windows or a type of plastic. But it is organic because it is carbon-based. It is manufactured with carbon. So why is this important? Because carbon has some properties, for example, and carbon-based life forms require oxygen, for example. And this brings us to last week. What is our atmosphere like? Does it support carbon-based life forms? Do we need it to support carbon-based life forms, or do we care? So, for example, why not take silicon as a life form? Because it can make 4 bonds, it can form long chains, and it can bond with oxygen. But there is actually a reason why it wasn't the prime choice for life on Earth, because it cannot form stable chains, it cannot bond with oxygen easily, even though it can, and it releases solid and not a gas during energy output. For example, when you look at the reason, you can see why in the chain of evolution, silicon was not the prime material for life. But this doesn't mean that we cannot get creative. Not everything has to be carbon-based. For example, we can have machines as life forms. In Horizon Zero Dawn, for some reason, machine animals have dominated Earth. This means humans have created them at some time in the past, and then they were set off to wander, for example. These aren't evolved machines. They weren't created spontaneously. They were created by some other entity which was then destroyed, or a civilization that was destroyed. But we can see this as a life form because they behave very much like animals. And actually in the game you can see the design choice, because it was said, let's make a game with robot dinosaurs, and everyone was probably like, oh yeah, yes, robot dinosaurs, that's an awesome idea, let's make that. And then they decided to write a story for that, because how will you explain robot dinosaurs? And this is what they came up with, and it is a good story. It is a good world building in that sense. These creatures are here for some reason. Humanity has lost the technology level that it has and has resorted to hunting, gathering, and then these things are about. And for example, these are sentinels from the Matrix universe, franchise, whatever. And these are intelligent guardian robots that try to hunt and destroy humans. And we can also see this as a life form. And these are from a Doctor Who episode, Clockwork things. I forgot the name. These are mechanical, not electronic at all. These are completely mechanical with gears and so on. And they follow a protocol. They obey order. They follow their programming, for example. But again, they can be seen as kind of a life form. And of course, we know these Transformers. For example, Transformers are a little cheesier in their story because in their planet, I think it was Cybertron, the planet, I don't remember, but they are the normal life form. So somehow they were formed like this in their planet. It's more like a fairy tale than a realistic world, but we don't care, because what we want to see in Transformers is cars that transform into robots, and that's what they give us. But what I'm trying to say about carbon and other stuff is, there is organic matter that we see around the world and we take as the basis for our life forms, but it doesn't have to be so. We can use other things and get creative. We can use magic as some sort of life form, and we can create, for example, a creature that is completely energy in form and that can pass through things. And for example, you can then create a shell for it, an outer shell. So when you see it, it's just like a ball, but inside it there's an energy form that makes it intelligent and such. I'm just improvising here. So we can use anything we want, but as I said, in the case of Horizon Zero Dawn, and because it's a game, this is important, the reason or the way that these creatures come to be should be explained properly. Or if it's a mystery, you should give some cues to the player. Or you can completely leave them in the dark, but it should be done well, skillfully, let's say. So now when we design something like this, we have to consider some stuff, whether it is organic. Let me just whether it is organic or inorganic material like this doesn't matter. So we should know about how life works. What we mean when we say something is alive. I think I've just deleted another slide. Yes. So we should look at the properties of life. What should we consider when we think something is alive? So life generally has an order in this cellular structure. And for example, in organics, cellular structure is a hierarchical order. So you have cells, and cells come together to form tissue, and tissues come together to form organs, for example. And organs come together to form a system. This is the digestive system. And systems come together to form an organism. This is this is very... Is it because I have a very bad connection? Sorry. You cannot see what I'm drawing at all. Let me just connect to a better stable thing. Okay, now it transmits better. No, I don't want to do it full screen. So, the order we have in life in our world is that we have cells and we have tissues that are formed by cells, and we have organs that are formed by tissues, we have systems, and we have organisms. Now, we have to consider this in our own things as well. So these will have transistors, for example, maybe, or these will have gears, and they will contribute to systems, and they will contribute to the organism itself, or in a sentinel, or in a bumblebee, for example. We have to consider the order of things. Okay. Then another important thing is sensitivity or response to stimuli, because this is basically what makes something alive. If when you prod it with something, it doesn't move, how do you know it's alive, or why do you care that it's alive? It should have some sort of response when things happen around it. If you put a rock somewhere and you say that this rock is alive and it doesn't do anything, then it wouldn't have any meaning for it to be alive. For example, there is a game called Swapper where you create clones of yourself. And if I remember correctly, Swapper has sentient stones. So these are stones that can think. Oh, upside down. Sorry. They can think, but you hear them thinking, but nothing happens. They don't move. They don't affect the game in any way. So they are basically flavor in there. They are world building, but it's an interesting touch. So you don't ask questions like how something that never moves can be intelligent, for example. But in most cases, sensitivity or response to stimuli is important when it's about life. And we have reproduction. This life form has to continue its life cycle somehow. Again, we don't know how it is handled in these, and these are manufactured, for example, not reproduced. I don't know. I don't think there is a production in transformers, and not in these. But it's an interesting case here. So you kill these animals by the dozens, for example, and then it creates the question: how are more of these made? Are they made in self-replicating factories, or do they have replication capabilities that are like organic beings? And we need adaptation because it's evolution. So adapting to the environment. We have growth and development in certain points in life. We have regulation, homeostasis. This is a very important concept. This is the basis actually of all concepts of life. We need some sort of energy processing, and evolution is a part of adaptation, heredity. So these are the things that we have to consider. We don't have to implement all of these in our creatures. We don't have to think about how they reproduce, for example, in terms of other mechanical things. We may not need to think about that. But these are the things that we can think about when we are creating some new life. For example, homeostasis is the state of equilibrium, as in an organism or cell, maintained by self-regulating processes. This is very important because that is what keeps us alive and functioning. So as humans, for example, we have to maintain a certain body temperature, 36.5 actually, but it doesn't, because this body temperature, internal temperature, is what our cells require to stay alive. And our cells in turn have a need of maintaining their cytoplasm. So they need fluid intake, but they also need to dispense fluid. And for example, if you put cells in a very saline solution with salt water, all the water inside the cell goes out and the cell dies, shrinks and dies. But in turn, if you put it into a very diluted environment with lots of water but no salt, the water rushes inside the cell and kills it. So we need a certain amount of water intake to keep our cells hydrated, and we need some certain amount of energy intake to keep them alive, our body temperature. So this is homeostasis for us. Humans need oxygen, and humans need water, and humans need energy, heat, to keep this system of systems, or organism of systems, trillions of cells, alive and running around doing things. To stay alive, basically. So access to enough water. In organic materials, this is access to enough water, prevent too much water loss, produce enough energy, and respond to temperature changes in the environment. But again, a mechanical device, for example, might have a very different set of requirements. It might not need water, but it might need oil, for example, to lubricate its joints and such. But how does it get that oil? Does it get it from a natural resource in the world, or does it get it from a replenishment station that is automated or something like that? But for example, when we think about life in any sense, we have to think how it balances itself to stay alive, to continue existing. Now, when we think about this, we have to think about where that life exists. Is it inside the sea, for example, where water is abundant? Is it a forest? Or is it some kind of Arctic environment? Or is it space, complete vacuum? How do you get energy when you are in vacuum from a star? How do you get matter? Do you need actually matter? Or is the organism an ecosystem in itself that just requires energy intake but no material intake? Blah, blah, blah. So when we are designing something, the thing we have to consider first, now you can forget about all of these. These are just the basis for what we are coming to now. The first question is, where does it live? Because where it lives will dictate most of its design choices. And then, what does it eat? Or what does it consume to keep the homeostasis? So in our world, we have a chain of a food chain, and each thing in the food chain acquires energy in some form and then dispenses it some other form. So for example, in our world, we have energy coming from the sun. Sun is our main energy source. For example, in a planet that is very far away from its sun, maybe the planet's core can be the energy source as some form of heat. But life basically needs energy to sustain that homeostasis state. And we have producers. Those are plants. Plants take in the energy and produce the first chains of energy from that. And then comes the primary consumers who consume the producers. And then there are secondary consumers who consume the primary consumers, blah, blah, blah. It goes like that. And the final consumer in the chain is called the apex predator because it doesn't have any natural enemies. Nothing eats that. For example, lion could be considered an apex predator in the savannah, even though it's not the biggest or the strongest because there are elephants around. But since elephants don't eat lions, lions are the apex predator in that environment. But when lions die, like everything else, they go back to the ecosystem with help of decomposers. And these are fungi and bacteria and such that cause decay. So this is a cycle actually, because decomposers decompose the materials coming from these animals and put them back in the soil so that the producers can produce more energy by taking in those nutrients. This is actually what we call an ecosystem. And for example, in our world, this ecosystem has balanced itself in lots of biomes in millions of years. So this isn't something that happens overnight. And when we consider these ecosystems, we have to consider the living things inside it. And I don't think I put the pyramid here, but an ecosystem has kind of a pyramidal structure. Just write it here. So the number is most at the bottom. These are producers. And then as you go up in the ladder, you have other consumers, but they are less in number because the more you go up the ladder, the less the energy becomes. So plants create lots of energy. This is a red plant for some reason. But when an insect comes and eats it, it cannot convert all the energy inside this because it will have some loss because of its own body systems or what it has to excrete and such. And when something eats that bug, it gets even less energy. So the amount of energy decreases as you go up the chain, which keeps the numbers decreasing because the number of animals that can survive at the amount of present energy decreases as well. So if in an ecosystem, if you create, for example, a very large number of apex predators and a very low number of plants, it is obvious that this cannot be sustained. So in time, the number of this predator will decrease, it will die out, and in turn, because they are not predated, the other animals will increase their numbers. So we don't strictly have to create an ecosystem in our game because these are all backdrops things, but they are things that we should consider. And there's also the interesting thing that when you introduce something different to the ecosystem, for example, as in the case in Australia was a closed ecosystem because it has ocean all around it. And when, of course, there were indigenous people, when Europeans came, they brought cats with them. This Felis catus, the domestic cat that we know. But the thing with Australia is, in its ecosystem, there aren't any large predators like lions or such. Everything in Australia is actually small. Well, when you think about spiders, they tend to be very big. But apparently, cat was the largest predator introduced to Australian ecosystem. And it completely toppled the ecosystem because cats were introduced, they started to reproduce, and they started to hunt the other smaller predators. So cats became the apex predator, and in a matter of decades, they disrupted the entire ecosystem of Australia. I don't know how they handled that, but it should have balanced itself by now. So this is an interesting concept because if you have a balanced ecosystem and you introduce a change into it, you may topple the entire thing. And there's a very interesting story about that, creating ecosystems in games. I will send its link to you. In this game, Ultima Online, it's a very old game. The developers wanted to create an ecosystem actually. They wanted players to go outside in the world and see wolves chasing rabbits, for example. And then more rabbits would pop up somewhere else. And then another thing would come and take the wolves. And the player would come into this environment and see this ecosystem in action. But it didn't work out because when they introduced the players into the environment, the players just started killing everything in sight as soon as it popped out. They killed the bears, they killed the wolves, they killed the rabbits, they killed the sheep because they were getting pelts from them and they were producing money with that. And this ecosystem was not composed of millions of animals. It was a small ecosystem. It was a token ecosystem. So when they introduced the most apex predator ever to the system completely crumbled. And they scrapped it and just put fixed spawn rates for each animal. So this is an example of a failed ecosystem experiment in a game, which is why we don't have ecosystems in a game mainly. But this doesn't mean we cannot make the illusion of an ecosystem. So you can create animals and you can create behaviors where animals hunt the other animals or run from other animals, and you don't have to tie this to a system that maintains the numbers, for example, but you can give that illusion. So other things we should consider. These are important things actually. What is the life cycle of the animal or the plant? So does it start growing and then bloom into a flower, for example, every 100 years, which will be important in a quest, and then die? Or does it grow and start hunting right away? So when you see a baby crocodile, you should be very afraid, for example. Or a dragon, should you be afraid of a dragon when it hatches first? And then comes the activity cycle. So is this a day creature, a night creature? So does it come out at night? For example, these can have very interesting design. This can be very interesting design choices for your game. When does the player encounter them, for example? Or if this is a quest, when should the player go out looking for them? For example, in Witcher, some monsters are out during certain times of day. Witcher 1, by the way. I'm talking about the first Witcher game. I haven't played the other two yet. So if you are going to hunt a certain type of monster, you have to go to a specific location where they live during a specific time of day so that you can encounter them. So this requires for you to plan and not just blindly follow the quest marker to go there and that animal will always be there and you hunt it down. You have to plan for it. For example, a different example of that is timed missions. And while this is not strictly creating an animal, there are such missions in the Mad Max game. So you have to do certain things at night. And does our animal or plant have hibernation capabilities? Does it sleep or not exist in our world for a certain amount of time? So this can be seasonal. This can be during if certain conditions are met. For example, some animals go into hibernation when they are cold. There are some frogs, I think. And during winter, this frog guy completely stops everything down to the beating of its heart and it freezes. And when it's warm again, it thaws out and becomes a normal animal. Or there are the bear, for example, the example everyone knows about hibernation. They just sleep and they conserve energy during winter. But also, there are other things. For example, some plant seeds go into hibernation mode. They can just exist for years without any water or anything or heat. But when you put them in the right condition, a moist environment with a good amount of heat, they start to come out and produce the plant that they are going to produce. And then there are things like tardigrades, for example. These are these small, weird-looking things. Let me just show there, and you will probably know about them. These are small things that are extremely durable. They are very, very small, microscopic actually, and they can even survive in the vacuum of space. These little guys. It can withstand gamma radiation that can kill us within hours. A lack of oxygen and the intense blast of solar winds, they can also go without food or water for over 10 years. So this is a form of life. I mean, it can apparently sustain its homeostasis state without any of these or presence of gamma radiation. So they are practically better at living than us. Or there are some jellyfish species, for example, that even if you chop them into 1,000 pieces, each piece can regenerate itself. And there is actually a zombie jellyfish type, which is when dead, the cells just spread around, go somewhere else, the singular cell, and start rebuilding the jellyfish. Or there was even something that could jumpstart itself after it is dead. So life is not exactly what we think of it. It can take very different forms. So we consider hibernation. So for example, in terms of trees, does it falls its leaves or is it evergreen? And we can think about social aspects. And this will be important. So is it a herd or is it a hive or is it a loner species? And another thing that we should consider is the reproduction. Does it reproduce sexually, which would suggest there is a female and male version of the animal or the plant, or it can be more than two sexes, for example. It can have an intermediary. So in a plant or an animal, you can have one female that produces an egg, and maybe a male that produces the sperm, and then something else that carries this between, and a third species, for example. In this ecosystem, it can be a bee that carries this. Let's make it a cute bee. Okay. So bee isn't a part of the plant, but it's a part of the sexual reproduction of the plant. For example, this is what constitutes an ecosystem. So insemination in this case can be in different ways. For example, there are some trees that have male and female versions, and they should be pollinized like plants. And then there is this very interesting concept of parthenogenesis, and this is where, for example, in a population there are females, but there is no male population. So the female lays an egg, a special kind of egg, that is self-fertilized. It doesn't use the sperm from a male, but this egg can produce offspring. And this is actually, this occurs in very special cases, because this is not a healthy reproduction. We need genetic diversification for the species to evolve and continue. But this is an emergency measure that some species take. And there are other species that can switch genders. For example, if it's an all-female population, one of the genders, one of the members of the population can turn into a male so that it can start fertilizing other members. These are all things that we see in our planet. It's not something that we see all the time or in the creatures around us, because we mostly see mammals as pets or animals, and they don't do this. But there are lots of animals that do strange stuff like this. So as Ian Malcolm would say, life finds a way. And then we have asexual reproduction. It can be vegetative. So this means when you plant a part of a plant somewhere in the soil, it just grows to be the big version of that plant. We have binary fission, which is our textbook example of cells dividing, making two cells from the same genetic material, and this is how bacteria reproduce. We have budding. I won't bore you with the details. I mean, first a small version of the creature forms at the side, and then it grows to become a normal-sized creature. We have fragmentation. When you cut a starfish, the cut part can create another starfish of its own. And then we have spores. That's how fungi evolve. So reproduce. They just poof their spores around, and that spores can create a new fungi. And okay, good. And these are all very interesting concepts. So how do we classify life? Now, when we go into classification, we won't need this much for our games, but it will be useful for certain things. In our world, do we actually need it? But we have domains, and we have a kingdom, animal kingdom. We have a chordata, for example. This is the creatures that have a spine. Class is aves, flying. Order is Passeformus. I don't know what these do. This is a family of Fringillidae, and genus of Cardinalis, and the species is Cardinalis cardinalis. Okay, this is a bird. So why do we even need such a classification? But it creates believability when you design different creatures, for example, and it's totally optional, of course. An example is the Felidae. I think it is the order. It's a genus, because Cardinalis cardinalis is genus. So for example, these are Felidae, these are Felinae, the sub-genus of that, and these are Pantherianae. Okay, so how do they classify these? How did people classify this? Well, when scientists started this, there was no genetics knowledge, so they mainly classified living things based on their abilities. So for example, Pantherianae are the felines that can roar, And felinae are the felines that cannot roar. This can meow, for example, but they don't have a roar like the Panthera genus. And within this, for example, this one is very different because cheetah is the only feline that doesn't have retractable claws. So in all other cats, let's say big cats, they can retract their claws and have paws basically, but cheetah always has its claws out. Interesting. So leopard is the one that likes water, unlike all other felines. But for example, what is the difference between a jaguar and a leopard? The jaguar has an extra tiny spot in the middle of its spots. That is how you spot it. So this is a very different, a very small difference, for example. But when you create these kind of animals, you can see that they share a resemblance. And where can we use this in a game? For example, if you are creating different biomes in your game, and these are leveled for an RPG game. So you have one biome here, for example, and a slightly higher level biome here, and an even higher level biome here. You can use this, you can basically use the same creature design in this one, and in this one, and in this one, but up the level and add stuff, some more threatening stuff and things, more spikes, a bigger tail, for example. But this can actually make sense. Why do we have three different versions of basically the same animal? Because they are part of a family and they have different aspects of that family. And let me just see. We have one more thing before we take a break. So in biology, we have 6 kingdoms basically. We don't have to use all of these, of course, but we have animalia, the animals, plantae, plants. Archaeobacteria are the ones that were found in that these are the basis of life. And eubacteria, today's bacteria and other microbes stuff. Fungi, the basically yeast and mushrooms, and protista are the primary forms of cells coming after archaeobacteria. So we generally don't use these because we cannot see them in the games. We can have them as a concept, but there is, unless you are making a microbiology game, you won't be using these. But these are the things that we like to use because they create interesting design choices and such. So it has been around 1 hour. Let's take a break. Let me stop the share and pause the recording from here.